Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have us with us once again tonight, the famous, not to say infamous, Dr. Buck Melton. Welcome, Buck.
Always glad to be here.
I know, the country is crying out now for new leadership and people that have the intellectual abilities to dance in Washington, D.C. Have you, in the middle of all this national turmoil, have you been approached by anyone, or can you talk about it?
If I saw someone approach, I would run very quickly in the other direction. Although, I must say, it's interesting that we are starting to hear whispers of a 2024 rematch between, of all people, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton.
Oh, wow. That would be amusing. Well, certainly politics has a certain whimsy to it that we can experience night and day, both in Macon, Georgia, and the national venue.
Yes. Well, with 300 million plus people, it's interesting that the same tired old names just keep.
Well, that would be. We have many amusing
and family dynasties.
Many amusing things can happen. Well, let's see. There are lots of things to talk about. One of the issues that's afoot in Washington these days is the filibuster. And I know as a constitutional scholar you have opinions about this. Maybe you could just say, is the filibuster a good idea or a bad idea?
If you make me summarize it in one word, I would lean more towards good than to bad. You say constitutional, although technically the filibuster is not written into the Constitution anywhere. It's just part of the Senate rules. So theoretically it can be changed, which is the whole point of what we're dealing with here.
Was there a filibuster in the era of George Washington, or when did it start, or do you know offhand?
I've not done a lot of research on it, and I really need to do more, but I seem to recall that the filibuster really started to emerge, interestingly enough, around the Jacksonian period. And people talk about it like it's a monolithic thing, but it's changed over the years. But one way or another, we're pushing 200 years at this point.
Now, filibuster, if I can recollect this, did that word mean something like a filibustering expedition?
Exactly.
So what's the connection?
Yeah, if I remember correctly, it's a Dutch word. It's roughly a translation to freebooter, which doesn't help a lot. It's one of these English words that's fallen by the wayside, but we would simply say pirate.
Yes.
We might even, if we make it more colloquial, it has the same meaning for us today as the word hijacker.
Yes. So the idea, these were put in the Senate rules, and presumably it would be possible to hijack the Senate, so to speak.
Yes.
You could just talk and talk and talk and stop all business.
Yes, and you really don't see the classic idea of the filibuster play out very, very often these days. Jimmy Stewart, what was his
Mr. Smith goes to Washington.
Yeah, you don't really see, every once in a while you'll see something sort of kind of like that, but nowadays the way it works, it's just more of a threat. If a member of the minority party says, I'm going to stand up and do this if you don't do that, and that's enough to trigger the filibustering process. So
now the filibuster has been abridged a little bit. Is that correct? In the past decade or so, the Democrats did something and the Republicans took advantage of it.
Yeah, but before we talk about the recent changes, maybe just to make sure, we ought to define the general idea of it.
Well, that's good. Yeah. Maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, and the Senate has sometimes been referred to, and I take issue with this, but you'll hear it referred to as the greatest deliberative body in the world. And if you think of the name Senate, it comes from people in their senescence. It's the community
senior or senescence?
Well, the same root. It's the old folks. Yes. And the idea is that old means wise, and it means more disinterested. You've cut your teeth, you've made your pile, you're stable.
Yes.
And the longer Senate terms as well, 6 years, means that essentially that the voters have short memories, and so you can reach across the aisle without repercussions in your own party. And when you add to that the additional fact that until 1913, senators were not elected by popular vote. They were elected by state legislatures. The idea is they were supposed to be insulated from the clamor of politics.
Or dare we say democracy?
Yes, yes.
So actually, there was a lot of concern with the founding fathers about having too much exposure to the masses, if I can say it that way. And so there are lots of restraints put in the Constitution.
Well, democracy was as bad a word in the 1780s and 1790s as commie was for our generation in the 50s and 60s. It's bad.
Everyone used the word republic,
yes.
And that was the model of the U.S., I think, when it started. And,
constitutional republic.
With a substantial limitation of the power of the voting booth.
Yes.
Lots of property requirements, also obviously racial issues and gender issues.
Yes.
So there was a very restricted electorate, and even that electorate was restricted in putting people in the Senate. And
yes,
so
correct.
there's a lot of restraint.
Correct.
And you could say power in the hands of the propertied classes.
Yes.
Is that right?
So although the Senate was diverse to a degree, I mean, it was certainly diverse as to geographic region. It wasn't nearly as diverse as the country we have today, and I think the goal was, both as the founders intended it and as got reinforced by the filibuster about a half century later, that collegiality would trump the diversity.
Yes.
And yet the diversity did have some protection there. So the Senate rules as they developed were that you didn't have to get to 50 votes. You only had to get to 40 votes to be able to block legislation. In other words, you had to have a supermajority on the Senate floor to be able to force your way over whatever minority had emerged.
Yes.
And the idea of that was that even in defeat, the minority would have some degree of input into the process, some way of forcing the majority to come to the bargaining table, as it were.
Isn't it interesting to compare the American Republican ideals with the British system?
Yes.
So with a parliamentary system where the dominant party puts the prime minister in, and there's not a written constitution, and they can really push through all kinds of legislation rather quickly and without too much trouble.
Yes, and that's why I've had a bit of a pause when we call the Senate the greatest deliberative body in the world. And perhaps in terms of collegial deliberation, that might have been the model, that might have been true, but anyone who has seen question time in the House and see the witty riposts and to and fro.
Prime Minister's question time.
Our members of Congress would be ripped to shreds in about 5 minutes under such a situation.
I don't want to
like
disabuse you of this, Bucky, but I think the questions are submitted, and the Prime Minister has a lot of time to be ready to respond. So it's not that it just does it off the cuff.
That's true, but it can be turned around on others, and they have to be prepared to think on their feet in a way that our legislatures just aren't.
Yes, it doesn't seem possible to get that degree of mentation among our politicians. Yes. Is that an overstatement, or
I suppose so.
I somewhat doubt it.
Yes. Was it Bacon who said, "Speaking maketh a ready man, reading a full man, and writing a precise man"?
Yes. Well,
so they're just not quite as ready in Congress.
Yes, indeed.
But anyway, so the idea is that the minority has some sort of input or check into the process, that you can't have a majority just steamroll its way through. But that seems to be what the majority very much wants to do today in this last 10 or 20 years.
With a very slim one,
yes.
I mean, and sort of, I mean, I think we could say this, the Democratic Party really wants to turn the ocean liner, the U.S. ocean liner, pretty dramatically to the left, more than you would think their electoral victories entitle them to do for such a narrow majorities everywhere.
Yes.
And the Republicans are saying, well, let's just be restrained with your actions, and the filibuster's a big deal. Now, if it were removed or changed, as it had, it was done, I think, and you can speak to this point, about a decade ago, when the Democrats changed it, and then it certainly rebounded against them.
Yes.
Can you speak to that point?
Yes, over the past 20 or so years, most of the pressure for, if we can say, greater democracy has in fact come from the Democratic Party. Not all of it, but that's been the tendency. Yes. And it's led to a great deal of hypocrisy, and that has led to an increase in the overall level of nastiness that we have been seeing in our national politics. So for me, the story actually begins around 2004 or so, when it was the Republicans who started floating the idea of doing away with the filibuster. And then Senate Minority Leader Harry Reid, recently deceased, made this impassioned speech about how we must give the minority some voice, and that the filibuster was sacrosanct and it must never be disturbed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And those sentiments carried the day. The Republicans backed off and the filibuster didn't get changed. Fast forward about 9 years to, I believe, 2013, and Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid oversaw the dismantling of the filibuster.
Yes. No surprise.
Over the strenuous objections of the minority party, which was at that time, of course, the Republicans. And they warned, if you do this, what comes around goes around.
Yes.
And I believe on both occasions the issue was the stonewalling of confirming of judicial nominations.
Yes.
But Harry Reid finally pulled the trigger and went through with what we call the nuclear option, which is a parliamentary means of nullifying it. And it rebounded because a few years later, the Republicans did the same thing to get, I forget who it was, not Brett Kavanaugh. It may have been Kavanaugh, it was the one just before Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, onto the Supreme Court by trampling the filibuster.
Yes.
So, and now we have Chuck Schumer, the new Senate Majority Leader, who during that period said we can't injure the filibuster any further, who now is campaigning for the complete eradication of the filibuster.
Well, what does that mean exactly when we consider politicians that speak in a hot and bothered way about one issue or the next, and then obviously they're so hypocritical that the voters just need to take anything that a politician says with a grain of salt, pretty much. I'm outraged, this happened, it'll never happen, it's against whatever.
Yes.
If it's in my interest to do it, of course it's all right.
It does not do any service to politicians in general. They may think it does service to them, keeping them in, but all of these politicians are from safe seats, so it doesn't do them any particular service. It does not do any service to the political process. It divides the country. It increases enmity between the two parties, and it's just very depressing and disturbing to see them doing this. It's irresponsible as well as hypocritical.
Well, things are sort of desperate in Washington, are they not?
Yes.
I mean, we have all this attention and a lot of sense the Democrats are having problems. So if they could control the process by which laws are made and propagated, then they could presumably do something that would encourage their support of their constituencies, and you're sort of stuck right now.
Yes, but I think it's a dangerous game to play when you have such potentially violent factions on both sides, and we have seen violence happen. We've seen them take to the streets. The Democrats themselves have been decrying what happened on January 6th of last year. I mean, they refer to it as an insurrection. I don't think I'd go that far, but the point is, there are many, many violently angry people on the extreme right as well as on the extreme left. Weapons of mass destruction, and by that I would include, as Democrats I think do, fully automatic weapons are available on every street corner. in that type of environment, you don't want to stir up, you don't want to stir the pot, and you don't want to contribute to a sense of illegitimacy. Rightly or wrongly, I do not believe that the Democrats stole the election. I do not believe that there was massive voter fraud in 2020. In all of the lawsuits that got launched in the wake of the 2020 election, none of them managed to produce solid evidence of voter fraud. Republican judges, Republican nominated and confirmed judges agreed with that assessment. So I don't think the election was stolen, but many, many people believe it was. And if you spike the ball by gaming the system, by admitting Puerto Rico and Guam as states, for instance, to pack the Senate, to do away with the filibuster, we could see in this country a new type of civil war, and I don't say that lightly. And I'm aghast that I am saying this, but I think that's what we're looking at.
Well, the tension titers are quite high and likely will be exacerbated by any kind of economic downturns, which is a little spooky, isn't it? The government's economic policy has just helicoptered money everywhere, and there's going to be, I think, a painful period as inflation, as efforts are made to rein that in.
Yes.
Sort of and in the middle of all this, we have the filibuster that presumably keeps the situation somewhat steady. I mean, if it's a, you could say, I mean, on the other side, well, all these good things we'd like to do, and there are a number of them, good policies, we just can't get these laws through. Though the power of the executive is so great, maybe we don't, and the bureaucrats in Washington, they really need laws.
Yes. Well, the power of the executive is a dangerous thing, and that's a completely separate issue that we've been ruling by executive fiat in many different ways, and that has increased drastically, really since the New Deal.
Yes.
But ultimately, the executive can't pay for things himself. That Congress has to vote a budget and appropriations. In that regard, I think the failure of the Build Back Better program, which was by a single vote, Joe
Yes.
Manchin saying no, I think that's a good thing. I think you're right. There are many things in Build Back Better that I agree with, that I
Yes.
would like to have seen, but with a $28 trillion debt that continues to mount, we can't afford it. We can't afford a lot of the things that we have now. That we are taxing future generations. Somebody will have to pay that bill at some point, and until we pay that bill, we can't consider new programs, desperately needed programs, environmental protection programs, global warming programs. But you get the feeling that these politicians are using this money not for the betterment of the common good, but simply to get themselves reelected.
Let me ask a question slightly off the subject, but one bill that's been introduced with bi-party support is limiting the power of or the ability of congressmen to trade on the stock market or trade on inside information.
Yes.
Now, that certainly seems appropriate to me, and I noticed that people in the Federal Reserve, they've been tainted a bit.
We've had a couple of high-profile resignations recently.
Right,
yeah.
as have judges. So
Yes.
there are judges that are, their wives are involved with money situations. And that I think that's a strong argument. And this is brought forth by the Democrats mainly, not totally. I think one of the Georgia senators.
That's awesome, yeah.
He brought this up. And
Yes.
Well, okay, maybe he's a bad guy, he's a Democrat, but maybe he can have some good ideas. And I like that idea.
Mm-hmm.
I think pay people more money, do whatever, but you can't trade on inside information, I think.
Yes.
Just imagine the power you could have, and you could there to get knowledge. Also, if you're on the Intelligence Committee, you know all kinds of things no one else does. Well,
Yes.
it looks like this, the whole deal with the Ukraine and Russia is just nothing but smoke and mirrors. Well, that's just one thought like that is a huge thing, and trading on that would be a big deal. Some countries, I think you have an accountant looks your money over when you go in, and when you leave, the accountant looks the money over again to be sure that you haven't noticeably profiteered. However, a lot of things, it's difficult to prevent knavery, and many times after people have left politics, that's when they make the big money.
Yes. Well, I will say, not all the time. There have been many people, especially career politicians, such as President Biden, such as Nancy Pelosi, who have been in there forever, who have made a pile while they're in. But speaking of that, I have to call out one more hypocritical moment. Nancy Pelosi believes that further congressional insider trading laws. Feel free to finish it
I'm
for
laughing.
me.
Well,
because she thinks this. Well, she thinks this injurious to the capitalist system and free enterprise.
This is a capitalist country, and we want. So if our politicians want to steal money, that's what happens.
She has never sung the praises of capitalism, to my knowledge, ever before, until her little nest egg is threatened. I mean, it's revolting. And I'm not picking out Democrats in particular. I started this whole story with Republicans threatening the filibuster 20 years ago. But
yes,
it's just.
And so presumably, if someone wanted to do something like this, the legislation could be filibustered. But I think there's enough bi-party support for this that would be impossible to do that.
Well, I'm wondering, and once again, the Democratic response to the Great Recession in 2008 was, let's pass some more laws. And the problem was we had plenty of laws, Glass-Steagall. We weren't properly enforcing the laws that were on the books.
Yes.
I haven't looked over the Ossoff proposal, but there's always going to be a loophole. And I'm put in mind of G. Gordon Liddy, who a truly scary individual. I've never quite seen the combination of comical and scary that you see with Liddy. But Liddy, of course, is a convicted felon.
Yes.
Was not able to own firearms. And so he boasted of the fact on his television show that he didn't own firearms, but his wife owned several firearms and kept some of them on his side of the bed. So, yeah, what do you do? Okay, you can't insider trade, but what about your spouse or partner? What about your secretary? I think it would have to be extreme. It would have to be that if you are elected to Congress, all of your finances must, by law, have to go into a blind trust that are managed by people you don't know. But even in that case, I mean, you could use cutouts or something to get the word to them.
Secret messages, you know.
Yeah, it reminds me of my Uncle Ed.
Uncle Ed?
Edward Mann up in Chapel Hill, Carrboro, North Carolina, who, when I was a graduate student at Duke, once told me the sage advice that the only thing a lock is good for is to tell an honest man where he is not supposed to go.
Yes.
And if you've got a fundamentally dishonest member of Congress up there who is bound and determined to insider trade, she or he is going to be able to do that.
Well, I think we started out talking about filibusters, but
Yes.
maybe we're really into the improving the political process.
Yeah, I think so.
And what can be done to make things better? Right now, we have the, you could call this gerrymandering. Mm-hmm. So we have these districts that have been put together, and I think the courts have said, well, I guess it's okay. But there are these really absurd districts that have popped up in different places, including Georgia. And I think one of the big things, I mean, maybe we're tilting toward the Republicans. We try and be neutral, but the Republicans have gerrymandered things enormously, and the Democrats, I believe, would do certainly the same thing.
Yes.
But you wind up with a group of people that are extreme in their viewpoints, and they have a district that, as long as you present these extreme viewpoints, you'll be reelected.
Yes. Well, Marjorie Taylor Greene comes to mind yeah.
Well, that's right, and she ran against a neurosurgeon. I must say that in the primary of
Well,
who's
what
rather good
what do
person.
neurosurgeons know about
Well,
politics?
he's a rather
And
good
stick to their
person.
brains.
Maybe he'll come back
Yes.
and have another go at it.
But yeah, she's made some major faux pas. Well, as you say, and once again, this is extremism, that when Obama was elected in 2008,
Yes.
for about 2 years, for about one session of Congress, just barely by a hair, but he could do it, the Democrats could run the table.
Yes.
They had a filibuster-proof majority by one vote in
Yes.
the Senate. And that is the way Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, got passed through some rules mechanics at the very end. That caused a predictable blowback.
Right.
The Republicans gained control in a lot of state legislatures in the census year of 2010.
Yes.
And you got that gerrymandering, and that was predictable. I mean, you're going to
Well,
play
we
hard.
still have it. Yes.
Yeah, you're
Yes.
going to play hardball. You're going to play hardball with us in Congress. We're going to play hardball right back. Was the sentiment, and it just exacerbated things.
You know, we have these two extreme polarized parties. Is there a place for more parties or something in the middle there?
I think the only time you ever see solidarity among the two parties is if a potential third party looks like it's really going to gain some traction.
Yes.
For instance, the Tea Party movement, for instance, or what have you. It bothers me that as we speak today, a recent Quinnipiac poll came out and said that the greatest fear of most Americans, that the real threat to America these days is not a foreign threat. It is a threat of internal disunity. And these are by, if I remember the poll, it's by wide margins. And that cuts across the parties. Both parties believe by significant majorities that our real problem is going to be domestic unrest. And that's a scary thing, and that ought to make people sit up and take notice.
Well, do you think something that could bring the country together would be a foreign threat? Maybe the China, maybe that would be something where people unite together against an alien force. I remember the 9/11 event, and certainly the country, I'm sure many people can recall it, the country really came together. I mean, at least that's my recollection.
You see, that didn't strike me, I mean, for a few days, yes, but in terms of a long-term sort of bonding kind of experience, I never really got that feeling. I do know that that it brought forth a more or less bipartisan USA Patriot Act, which ironically really undercut American civil liberties and criminal procedural rights in a big way, which...
Isn't that supposed to sunset? And I think they didn't. I believe it has a sunset.
I'll need to look into that. It has been extended. So.
I think they just keep extending it. It really is a little spooky, isn't it?
Yes. But I don't know. I think the threat is the fact that everyone wants to spike the ball. That the most important word in American politics has always been compromise. And compromise means that you will not get your way in all of the big matters. You'll get something, but you won't get everything. And for some reason, people are less willing to settle for that. The gulf is so wide that we see other Americans as the enemy to be eradicated. But we will either kill each other in the streets, or we will come together and agree to compromise.
Do you think the way the media castigates the different politicians makes it impossible to go across the aisle and shake hands? I mean, the idea, well, I don't know, Biden, could you shake hands with Biden easily or with Donald Trump? I mean, could people do that? I mean,
it's got to be a grassroots thing. We all, or a sizable number, have to embrace this and deal with it and ignore the extremists who refuse to be converted. It's not going to be an easy process, but the alternative is, I hate to end on this and I hate to sound melodramatic, the alternative is some kind of civil war.
Well, I sighed. Boy, there would be nothing more catastrophic than that. If
Yes.
people say, oh, those people irritate me so much, let's just fight it out on the streets. You don't know what you're talking about.
No, they really
You
don't.
don't want to fight anybody in,
No.
in America. You
So
don't wanna-
maybe we can avoid that and have an attack of sanity.
Yes. Well, I appreciate you being here tonight, Bucky. And
Always.
we look forward to many other good interchanges with getting your special insight to present to the local American people.
Well, I
here.
do the Vulcan salute at the end since we don't do COVID handshakes anymore, so maybe this is a good one to do the full thing. Peace and long life.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Bucky. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.